Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains sadly lost to the march of time. And today, we are going to discuss locomotives that wound up pretty much just like that. Because these locomotives were actually preserved. They were supposed to be saved for future generations to enjoy and appreciate in one form or another. But, for one reason or another, they wound up destroyed, scrapped anyway, despite the fact that they were preserved specifically to avoid that exact situation. These are 5 preserved locomotives that wound up scrapped anyway. Duluth, Missabe, and Iron Range number 221. Number 221 was one of DM&IR's Yellowstones. Yellowstones are an often overlooked locomotive in railroad history, notable for being, well, big, almost as large as Big Boys. They were 2 884s. Big Boys are 4 884s. But they were close. Simple articulates just like Big Boys. They were actually pretty successful. 72 in total were built, and Northern Pacific, Southern Pacific, as well as DM&IR, used this type of locomotive. Now, all of Northern Pacific and Southern Pacifics were scrapped. However, 3 of the Yellowstones from DM&IR did wind up being preserved. They had a total of 18. 8 were built in 1941, and 10 of them were built in 1943. The 3 that are preserved are on display in Minnesota. Number 225 is at Proctor, number 227 is at the Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth, and number 229 is at Two Harbors. But 229 wasn't originally at Two Harbors. Another locomotive was, 221. And in fact, 221 wasn't originally supposed to be there either. Originally that was 236. And before 236, it was 222. What the heck is going on at Two Harbors? Well, in 1960, 222 was put on display in Two Harbors after it was retired. But it only remained there for a few months before it was decided that it was needed for a DM&IR fan trip. It was taken out of retirement and put back into service. 236 was then placed in that spot to replace 222. But sometime later, 236 was removed because they needed her to provide steam for iron ore thawing duties as a stationary boiler. Then 221 was put there. 221 remained there for a decent amount of time. You'd think she'd be kind of preserved. But the problem was that in that time, there was no coverage over that spot. These days, there's an overhang protecting 229. But 221 fell prey to both Mother Nature as well as heavy amounts of vandalism. It got to the point where she was just not considered worth it to restore. Too much damage had been done to her. The decay was that bad. The railroad felt that she just needed to be scrapped. As late as 1967. In June that year, 229 was put in that spot. And she's been there ever since, protected from the elements and presumably vandalism, much better than her poor sister had been. Moel Tryfan. Moel Tryfan? I think it's Moel Tryfan. But I'm sure somebody will correct me in the comments and be like, actually, it's Moel Tryfan or something ridiculous because I can't get anything right anymore. This locomotive was a narrow gauge steam locomotive actually, and it was a single Fairley 064T. It was built for use on the North Wales Narrow Gauge Railway, but eventually it found its way to Welsh Highland Railway, and finally to the, hold on. Festiniog. That's apparently how you say that, according to the internet. Festiniog is actually a heritage railway that's based on 1 foot 11.5 inch narrow gauge. That railway is actually notable because the Festiniog Railway Company, which owns it, is actually the oldest surviving railway company in the world. Those lines originally opened in 1836. They were restored in 1954, and they're still in operation as of now. Since she wound up there, you'd think Moel would be alright, but no, not so much. She was dismantled in 1936 for an overhaul, but the repair work was stopped later that same year in October, and it was never recommenced. When Vestiniog initially closed in 1946, she was still there in her stripped-down state. That was until she was rediscovered when the Vestiniog Railway reopened in the 50s. By that point, she was nearly rusted into oblivion. Putting her back together again, restoring her at all, would be a tall order. On the 2nd of October 1954, she was towed to Porthmadog Harbor Station, where she was finally cut up for scrap. But it was for a good cause, in fairness. Proceeds from her sale were used to fund other restorations on the railway, and her trailing bogie survived and was used to provide pony trucks for the locomotives Linda and Blanche when they were converted from 040 STs into 240 STs plus Ts. So, at least pieces of Moel were used to help other locomotives. Sadly, Moel herself is long gone. Great Western Railway Star Class North Star and Iron Duke Class Lord of the Isles. This is a double entry, as they both happen at a very similar time, as well as on the same railway, the Great Western Railway. The Star Class was a series of 222 broad gauge locomotives that were supposed to be for passenger service. Designed by Robert Stephenson, they were introduced to service between November 1838 and November 1841. The last of them wouldn't be withdrawn until 1871, a total of 12 of them being built overall. The Iron Dukes were a similar case. They were 4 22s, broad gauge steam locomotives for express passenger service, built between 1847 and 1855. The last of them wouldn't be withdrawn until the late 1880s. And both of these classes were historically relevant for the Great Western Railway. They were cutting edge in their day, and were a big part of making the company a success at the time. 2 of them were supposed to be preserved. Like I said, Star Class North Star and Iron Duke Class Lord of the Isles. Neither of them were, though. Why? A nasty rumor was started years ago, saying that Stanier had been the one to scrap both of these, but he was only a junior manager at that time, and he wasn't even working at the Swindon Works where the locomotives were. Both locomotives had been stored in the same place, a shed at Swindon Works, and they were occupying space. They'd been there for a long time, waiting for a museum or somebody to take them. They didn't necessarily want to scrap them, but none of the museums that were offered them were willing to take them. And with little option, the committee finally decided simply to scrap them. Keep in mind this was going on between 1903 and 1905. The preservation movement wouldn't really get going for another 50 years. Preserving any locomotive that wasn't a part of a specific historical event was a hard sell, even to a museum, and that's why neither one wound up surviving. Though it is worth mentioning, in North Star's case, there is a replica of her that was built using some of the parts of the original that were able to be saved. There doesn't seem to be a remnant of Lord of the Isles, although her sister, Iron Duke, was given a replica using parts of 2 Hunslet Austerity tank engines. Speaking of using another locomotive to build a different locomotive, oh boy, this one's going to be a little controversial. Brooklyn East District Terminal number 15. This comment section is going to be a disaster, no matter what I say. Okay, here we go. Number 15 is an HK Porter saddle tank steam engine, the 060 ST, which is already really rare for an American, because we didn't use that many tank engines in general over here, let alone a saddle tank design. As her name might imply, she worked for the Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal Railroad, mostly as a dock shunter in Brooklyn, New York. But after the railway was modernized with diesels, she was moved to the Southern Appalachian Railway in 1965. She actually survived there until 1975, and then she was moved to the Toledo, Lake Erie, and Western Railway in Grand Rapids, Ohio, where she was put on static display for the next 23 years. A nice story, though. She was on static display, seemed all good. What happened? Was she vandalized? Was she just damaged beyond repair? Well, no. She wasn't necessarily scrapped. She's still around, and in fact is in operation. She was just rebuilt. Oh yes. Perhaps some of you have always wondered, how did Strasbourg get a hold of an actual working Thomas replica steam locomotive? After all, it can't be an E2, those are long gone. Well, more observant people probably have noticed that this particular tank engine doesn't work exactly like Thomas, as Thomas doesn't have outside cylinders. This one does, because this, of course, isn't Thomas, because, duh, this is number 15. Strasbourg Railroad purchased her in 1998, and she arrived there on the 9th of May. Then, she underwent a full conversion into Thomas, running again for the first time on the 29th of April 1999 in her new form. This is a controversial decision by Strasbourg. For one thing, Strasbourg is of course a heritage railway, the original heritage railway when it comes to the United States. It seems to defy the spirit of them that they would, shall we say, effectively destroy a preserved steam locomotive. Isn't that kind of counterintuitive to what they should stand for? Yes, I would say so, but I resist demonizing them over it, purely because I get it. For one thing, the Day Out with Thomas event makes them just all the money. I don't think you understand how much money they make at that event, because I assure you, it is so much. Many other railroads do a Day Out with Thomas event, but none of them are as good as Strasbourg's, particularly since their Thomas replica is one of the closest that there is. A lot of the others are just kind of, yeah, that's close enough. That looks just like Thomas, right? That works. Yeah, okay. I don't even care. Whatever. Strasbourg actually tried, so much so that they created an actual working Thomas steam locomotive. They just built it off of a pre-existing one, which was number 15. They need that amount of money to continually fund their operations at the quality that they shoot for. So I totally get why they'd want to do that, and it has been over 20 years since it happened. Thomas isn't going anywhere. And to be fair, inside, it's still number 15, and she's still in operation. They still use her for the event every single year, and she helps make them money, with ticket sales as well as the tremendous amount of Thomas merchandise that they sell there. I've taken my son there multiple times, particularly when he was younger, so I can vouch for the event myself. Purists and foamers probably would rather have the original number 15, but from a commercial perspective, and the fact that they have to make money to actually run their operations, I do understand why they wound up doing this. The North British Atlantic, Midlothian, sometimes called NBR Class H or LNER Class C11s. So what could top Strasbourg Railroad intentionally rebuilding a preserved steam locomotive? Well, what about a steam locomotive that was scrapped twice? Yeah, I know. What? How? The H classes were a group of 442 steam locomotives that were built for the North British Railway. They had a rough go at it at first because they were huge for the time, frankly. They were the heaviest, longest, and most powerful locomotives ever to be used on the railway. At first, they had trouble. For one thing, they couldn't fit on the turntables, which, really, how are you doing this? How did that happen? And there was some resistance to using them as people thought they were just too powerful, particularly James Bell, who was the NBR civil engineer. But over time, management finally got down to how to use these new powerful locomotives, and they served for many good years. They were tremendously successful during their time, so much so that one, even back in the 30s, was supposed to be preserved, the Midlothian, whose NBR number was 875 and LNER number was 9876. Midlothian was the final member of the class to be withdrawn in December of 1937. Given the historical relevance of the type, the order was issued that she should be preserved. However, the order wasn't received until she'd already been scrapped at Calais. She was in pieces, quite literally. But, to their credit, they put her back together. Her component parts were mostly still in existence at the time, and her frame was still fully intact. She was rebuilt and returned to service for transfer to the LNER Railway Museum at York. They cared quite a bit about getting this right, so much that they actually rebuilt the handful of parts that were genuinely scrapped and lost, like one of her main connecting rods. But she only lasted in preservation for a few months. Then, the Second World War broke out. Suddenly, the UK needed just all the metal they could possibly get their hands on, so they could produce more aircraft to defend themselves from the Blitz. Midlothian was withdrawn from the museum's stock, and scrapped for a second time, this time permanently, and her metal wound up being used in the construction of aircraft. A sad end for what could have been a nice preserved locomotive, the only one of her class, but to be fair, it was World War II, and I understand the UK's need to protect themselves from the invaders. And think about it, maybe, if luck is on her side, some metal from the Midlothian possibly wound up in a preserved Spitfire that you could still see flying today. It's not something anyone can probably confirm that easily, if at all, but it's a nice thought. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Somedude267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoff 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Ohio Trucker 1, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Bry Dagger 8, Twin Fox, and Jack Carson's Railroad Videos. Till next time, this is Darkness, individual of Fond, farewell.